left in the darkness, destined for greatness. The streets of Brookhaven were nearly empty that night, their usual rhythm dulled by the cold embrace of winter. Streetlights flickered, their dim glow barely cutting through the thick fog rolling through the alleyways. A stray cat darted between piles of discarded newspapers, its hungry eyes searching for scraps. Amidst this forgotten corner of the city, a lone figure stood frozen under a broken street lamp. Laura clutched the tiny bundle in her arms, her breath shaky as she gazed down at the fragile life she had carried into this world. The baby's soft whimpers broke through the night's eerie silence, his tiny fingers curling against the rough fabric of the old blanket wrapped around him. The dim glow of the moon illuminated his delicate features, rosy cheeks, wisps of soft, dark hair, and a tiny cleft lip, barely noticeable in the pale light. Laura swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent months battling with this decision, convincing herself there was no other way. But standing here now, on the brink of letting go, the weight of it threatened to suffocate her, a mother's silent battle. Laura had once dreamed of a different life, a life where she could be the mother this child deserved. But dreams didn't pay for rent, didn't fill an empty stomach, didn't erase the harsh reality of a world that had never made room for her. She had been cast aside the moment she revealed her pregnancy. The father, a man who once whispered promises of forever, had vanished the second he heard the word baby. Her parents, who had barely tolerated her struggles, saw the cleft lip on the sonogram and declared it a curse, a shame they refused to bear. Now, with no home, no family, and no future, Laura was left standing under a flickering light, about to do the one thing she had sworn she'd never do. She tightened her grip on the baby, feeling his soft warmth against her chest. Maybe there was another way. Maybe she could keep running, keep fighting. But then, the cold truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had nothing. She had spent weeks sleeping in shelters, eating whatever scraps she could find, trying to shield her son from the cruel whispers of strangers who glanced at his cleft lip and looked away in pity. How could she ask him to survive in a world that had already decided he wasn't enough? A sharp gust of wind bit at her skin. Her hands trembled as she stepped toward the worn wooden bench near the edge of the small city park. The baby stirred, letting out a tiny cry. Tears blurred her vision. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Forgive me." She placed him down carefully, tucking the old blanket around his tiny frame. Her body screamed for her to stop, to pick him up to run. But she didn't, because she knew, if she did, he would suffer in ways she couldn't bear to watch. Her hands hovered over him for a moment, then she turned. And she ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. A cry in the darkness. The baby's cries echoed through the empty park, a desperate plea that went unheard by the silent streets. The night stretched on, the cold creeping closer. But he was not alone. A shadow emerged from the alley, moving cautiously toward the bench. Golden eyes glowed in the dark, catching the faint moonlight. A large, scruffy stray dog, ribs protruding from beneath a matted coat, crept forward. He sniffed the air. Something small, helpless, and strange was here. He let out a soft whimper, nudging the bundle with his cold nose. The baby shifted, letting out another tiny cry. The dog paused. Something deep in his instincts stirred. Protection. Without hesitation, he let out a deep guttural bark, one that cut through the silence like a warning bell. Then another, and another. Somewhere in the distance, a light flickered on in a small apartment. A shadow moved behind the curtain. The front door creaked open. A chance encounter. Sarah Matthews had been dozing off when the barking reached her ears. She frowned, pushing herself up from her worn-out couch, rubbing her tired eyes. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, and knew its sounds by heart. But this was different. Wrapping a coat around her shoulders, she stepped out into the frigid night, her breath fogging in the cold air. The barking continued, louder, more urgent. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit street. And then she saw it. A small bundle on the bench. Sarah's heart stopped. She ran. Reaching the bench, she knelt down, her hands shaking as she peeled back the blanket. A baby. Tiny. Cold. Crying. Her breath hitched. "Oh my God," she whispered. The baby let out a weak whimper, his tiny fingers curling in search of warmth. Sarah's nurse instincts kicked in instantly. She lifted him into her arms, pressing him close to her chest to share her body heat. His skin was freezing. How long had he been out here? She looked around, searching for any sign of a desperate mother nearby. But there was no one. Only the dog, watching her with intelligent, expectant eyes, tail wagging slightly, as if it knew it had done something good. Sarah swallowed hard, glancing down at the baby again. She could call the police, she could wait for child services to arrive. But she already knew how that story ended. She had seen too many abandoned children shuffled from foster home to foster home, their spirits breaking a little more each time. She wouldn't let that happen. She had a choice to make. And she already knew the answer. She pressed a soft kiss to the baby's forehead and whispered, "You're safe now." A future unwritten. Years later, this moment would be the beginning of a story that shook the world. This tiny, abandoned baby would grow up to face challenges beyond imagination, yet somehow he would rise. He would defy the odds. He would prove that where we start doesn't define where we end. But for now, he was simply a child, held in the arms of the one person who had chosen to fight for him. And that choice changed everything. A boy without a name, a destiny unfolding. The walls of the orphanage were cold, gray, uninviting, and lifeless. The echoes of children's laughter filled the halls. But to William, it felt distant, like a world he could never fully belong to. For 7 years, he had called this place home, though it never truly felt like one. The days blurred together, a routine built around survival rather than love. Wake up, eat, school, chores, bedtime. Repeat. But deep down, William knew one thing. He wasn't like the others. And in the world of foster care, being different meant being overlooked. A child unchosen. Every week, prospective parents would visit the orphanage. Some were kind, offering warm smiles and words of hope. Others were cold, their gazes calculating as if they were shopping for the perfect child. William never got chosen. He saw kids come and go, their rooms emptied, their beds replaced with new arrivals. He had stopped hoping years ago. He wasn't like the other children. He didn't run up to visitors, didn't try to impress them. Why would he? Every time he had tried, they looked at his face first. His cleft lip, though repaired with surgery when he was younger, still left behind faint scars, scars that made people hesitate. Some didn't even try to hide their disappointment. "Poor boy," they would whisper. "He might struggle in school. Such a sweet child, but maybe we should keep looking." They didn't say it outright, but he knew what they were thinking. He wasn't perfect. And no one wanted a child who wasn't perfect. A world that didn't make room for him. The rejection hurt, but William learned to push it down. He built walls. At school, he stayed quiet, keeping to himself. He learned to be invisible, a shadow in the background, unnoticed, untouched. But even invisibility couldn't shield him from everything. There were always bullies, the ones who saw weakness and pounced. "Why does your mouth look like that?" one kid had sneered. "Did the doctor mess up fixing you?" William never fought back. Not because he was weak, but because he knew fighting wouldn't change anything. He had seen what happened to kids who fought back. They got labeled troublemakers, and troublemakers never got adopted. So he stayed silent. And he waited. For what? He didn't know. Maybe for the day someone finally saw him. A visitor unlike any other. The orphanage had seen plenty of visitors before, but never someone like him. It was an ordinary afternoon when the sound of an expensive car's engine rumbled outside the orphanage gates. The children barely noticed. People came and went all the time. Wealthy donors, government officials, volunteers. But when the heavy wooden doors swung open, a strange silence settled over the room. A man stepped inside, and William knew instantly he was different. He wasn't like the hopeful couples who walked through these halls, looking for a perfect child to complete their family. He wasn't like the donors who came for publicity, snapping pictures with smiling kids before disappearing forever. No, this man belonged to a different world. Tall, with a commanding presence, he wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that fit his broad shoulders with ease. His polished shoes gleamed under the dim orphanage lights, and the golden watch on his wrist probably cost more than the entire orphanage's monthly expenses. He was powerful. He was intimidating. And yet, there was something about him. Something in his eyes. They weren't just looking around. They were searching. A question that changed everything. William didn't expect the man to notice him. No one ever did. So when he stalked in front of William's usual quiet corner, the boy barely reacted. The man crouched down to his level, resting his arms on his knees. For a long moment, he just studied him. Then he asked, "You don't play with the others?" William hesitated, then shook his head. The man raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" William's fingers tightened around the old stuffed dog he always carried, his only possession, the only gift he had ever received. He swallowed hard before whispering, "They don't want me to." The man's gaze didn't waver. "And why do you think that is?" William hesitated again. He had never been asked this before. No one had ever cared enough to ask. After a long silence, he whispered, "Because I'm not like them." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't pity him. He didn't look uncomfortable. Instead, he simply nodded, a mirror of the past. Something stirred in the man's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He knew that look in William's eyes. He remembered it, because once, long ago, he had been that boy. He had sat in an orphanage, just like this, watching people walk past him, never stopping, never choosing him. He had fought his way out of that life, turned his pain into power, built an empire from nothing. And yet, standing here, looking into the eyes of a boy who had no one, something shifted inside him. Without thinking, he spoke. "William, do you know who I am?" The boy shook his head. The man extended a hand. "My name is James Harrington." William blinked, recognizing the name. Even the orphanage staff whispered about him. A billionaire, a businessman, a man who owned skyscrapers, industries, entire cities. What was he doing here? A decision that defied logic. James wasn't supposed to be here. He had come to the orphanage on a whim. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. But now, looking at this small boy, the boy no one had ever chosen, he felt something shift. For the first time in years, he was faced with a choice that had nothing to do with money, contracts, or power. It had everything to do with a future, with a boy who had no one, and with a man who had everything, except someone to share it with. James made his decision. He extended his hand once more. "Come with me, William." The boy hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand. No one had ever offered him something without conditions, without expectations. And yet, for some reason, he trusted this man. Slowly, cautiously, William reached out and took his hand. And in that moment, everything changed. Forever. A new life, a new battle. A world beyond the orphanage. William had spent his entire life in the shadows of the orphanage's gray walls. He had never dreamed of a life beyond those walls, because dreaming was a luxury for kids who got picked. But now he was leaving. Not in the way he had imagined. Not to another foster home where he would be shuffled around until he aged out. No, this was different. He had been chosen by James Harrington, a billionaire, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, a man who, for some reason, had walked into the orphanage one day and seen something in him. As he sat in the back seat of the black luxury car, Clutching his old stuffed dog, he watched the city blur past the tinted windows. The streets, once a distant noise beyond the orphanage gates, now unfolded before him like a story he was suddenly a part of. It didn't feel real. James sat beside him, silent but watchful. His presence was overwhelming, yet not unkind. William shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what to say, or if he was even allowed to speak at all. Finally, James broke the silence. "This isn't going to be easy." William blinked, looking up at him. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. James exhaled, tapping his fingers against the leather seat. "I don't do things for show, William. I didn't adopt you because of pity, and I didn't do it for attention." His gaze hardened. "I did it because I see something in you. And I don't give handouts, I give opportunities." William wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. James continued, "This is your second chance. What you do with it is up to you." William clenched his stuffed dog a little tighter. "And if I fail?" James met his eyes. "Then you get up and try again." There was something final in his tone, something that told William this man didn't believe in weakness. He swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he was ready for this. But then again, when had life ever given him a choice? The mansion on the hill. When the car finally stopped, William stared out the window in stunned silence. The house, no, the mansion, was enormous. It stretched across the estate like something out of a storybook, with tall marble columns, shimmering glass windows, and gates so high they felt like they were meant to keep out the entire world. William had never seen anything like it. His entire life had been spent in small, cramped rooms filled with too many kids and not enough warmth. This place, it looked like it belonged to kings. The butler, an older man with sharp eyes and a kind smile, greeted them at the door. "Welcome home, Master William," he said, his voice deep and formal. Home. That word didn't fit in William's mouth. James led him inside, and immediately the sheer vastness of the house made him feel small. The ceiling stretched high above him, chandeliers dripping with light. The air smelled expensive, like polished wood, and something warm he couldn't quite place. William didn't move. James studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to be afraid." William looked at him. "I don't belong here." James raised an eyebrow. "Who told you that?" William hesitated. "Everyone." James sighed, rubbing his temple. "Listen to me, William. This house, this life, it's not about money. It's about what you do with it. And if you think you don't belong, prove yourself wrong." William wasn't sure how, but he nodded anyway. Because what else could he do? Learning to be someone else. The days that followed were a test of patience, both for William and for everyone around him. Nothing in this house felt familiar. Everything was too clean, too organized, too different. His room alone was bigger than the entire dormitory back at the orphanage. And the food, actual cooked meals, warm and rich with flavors he had never tasted before. At first, he didn't know what to do with it. The first night, when the maids brought out a meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and vegetables, William didn't touch it. James noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. William lowered his gaze. "I don't know how to eat like this." James frowned, then pushed his own plate aside. "Then we'll figure it out." They sat there in silence, and slowly William picked up the fork. Bit by bit he learned. Not just about eating, but about everything. How to dress in clothes that weren't secondhand. How to hold a conversation without staring at his feet. How to walk through a world that had once ignored him. But not everything came easily. The other kids in the elite private school James enrolled him in didn't welcome him. They saw him as an outsider. And for the first time in a long time, William realized money didn't erase the past. The struggle to fit in. The first week at school was a disaster. Whispers followed him down the hall. Rich kids had their own way of making someone feel small. "That's the orphan boy," Harrington must have felt bad for him. Does he even know which fork to use? William kept his head down. He didn't belong here, and they made sure he never forgot it. The only thing that kept him from breaking was James. They don't define you, he told him one night after dinner. They don't know what you're capable of. William wanted to believe him, but the world had spent too long telling him otherwise, proving them wrong. One afternoon, while waiting for James to pick him up, William overheard a group of boys laughing near the parking lot. Harrington's new project won't last long. He's a nobody. Bet you he'll be gone in a year. That was the moment something shifted inside him. For years, he had accepted being overlooked. He had accepted being unchosen. But now someone had picked him, and he wasn't going to waste it. That night, he walked into James' office and said the words that surprised even himself. "Teach me." James looked up from his papers. "Teach you what?" William met his gaze, his voice steady for the first time. "Teach me how to be like you." James smiled, and just like that, the real training began. The beginning of something greater. The world had doubted him from the start. They had expected him to fail. But William had a secret. He wasn't going to prove them wrong. He was going to make sure they never doubted him again. And in doing so, he would change everything. The boy who became more. A legacy of doubt. For years, William had been told who he was. He was the unwanted orphan, the boy with the cleft lip, the child who would never belong. Even after being adopted by James Harrington, a man who saw something in him when no one else did, the whispers followed him. The world refused to believe that an orphan could become anything more than his past. But William was not the same boy anymore. He had spent years learning, growing, fighting, not with fists, but with knowledge, strategy, and an unshakable determination. James had given him a home. But it was William who built his future, a test of fire. When William turned 25, James stepped down as the head of his empire. The world was shocked when he announced his successor. Not a seasoned businessman, not an heir born into wealth, but an orphan who had once had nothing. The media called it a mistake. The business world called it a gamble. A boy from the streets can't run an empire. He's nothing without James. This will never last. William heard every word. But instead of breaking under the pressure, he did what he had always done. He proved them wrong, defying expectations. Under William's leadership, Harrington Industries didn't just survive, it flourished. He restructured failing divisions, brought innovation, and made investments that others deemed too risky. And for every victory, every success, the whispers grew quieter. Until one day, they stopped altogether. Because William wasn't the orphan boy anymore. He was a leader, a visionary, a man who had turned his pain into power. The return to where it all began. One evening, years after taking over the empire, William returned to a place he had never forgotten. The orphanage. It looked smaller than he remembered. Though the walls were still cold and gray, the children inside still carried the same quiet loneliness he once did. He met with the new director, an older woman who had replaced the headmistress from his childhood. "Why are you here, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her voice uncertain. William smiled softly. "Because I remember what it felt like to sit in that corner and wait for someone to see me." The next day, he announced a project that shook the world, a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to giving orphan children access to education, mentorship, and opportunities. Not charity, not handouts. A chance, the same chance James had given him all those years ago. And just like that, the cycle was broken, a story that would be remembered. Years later, a journalist asked William, "Do you ever think about the woman who abandoned you?" William took a slow breath. "I used to." He stared out the window of his office, the city skyline stretching before him. "For a long time, I wondered why she left me that night. But then I realized, She gave me something no one else did. The journalist frowned. What's that? William turned back, his expression calm. A beginning. A beginning. He nodded. Some people are born into greatness. Others have to fight for it. But the ones who truly make a difference, they're the ones who take their pain and turn it into something unstoppable. The journalist sat in stunned silence. William smiled. I wasn't abandoned. I was set free. And with that, he stood, shook the journalist's hand, and walked away. Not as the orphan boy, not as the unwanted child, but as the man who had rewritten his own destiny. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.